China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're happy to see you in the chair, the President of the Security Council, and we're grateful to the Executive Director of UNICEF, Madam Four, and the Assistant Secretary General for Humanitarian Issues, Madam Miller, for their statements. Mrs. Miller has done a great deal in her post, especially with regard to covering so-called forgotten crises. And in general, she has demonstrated talent and a principled approach as a humanitarian. Thank you for your work. Mr. President, since meetings of the Council take place regularly, perhaps too regularly, many members of the Council, as I can imagine, can write statements for each other. We, for example, knew in advance what the colleagues from the P3 and humanitarian penholder would say. We have heard these ideas more than once. Colleagues can probably imagine our comments and remarks, although they usually prefer to ignore them. It's easier that way. But I suggest we do something different today and focus on the recent report of the Secretary General on alternatives to the Syrian-Iraq border crossings in Yarubia that was formerly closed by the decision of the Council, and humanitarian situation in Syria. In these reports, there's very many moments of concern, which we, together with colleagues from the UN, would like to express our worry. Amongst these issues is the humanitarian situation in Idlib. We're convinced that it's not a normal situation where in an area of major humanitarian operation with a budget of hundreds of millions of dollars, people several days or weeks are forced to spend the night in the open. We believe that it was possible to predict this and prepare for this situation, especially regarding the winter period. Now, the Turkish side is not creating any obstacles to humanitarian deliveries to Idlib, and the humanitarian workers have plenty of resources, so why hasn't this problem been resolved? Furthermore, from reports of humanitarian NGOs, we know that among IDPs, there are people who died from their heaters catching fire in temporary tents. Those are the reasons, rather than freezing, as some colleagues are trying to present, are the reasons for the death of most of those who have suffered. And we believe that the humanitarian workers and the companies supplying these devices should react, and that these incidents can be avoided in the future. Now let's return to the report of the Secretary General. In the course of previous meetings of the Council, colleagues from other delegations have often criticized us that the Russian position is not in any way backed up by the facts, and that we are almost alone in our insistence on that position. But today, I think, is an excellent opportunity to provide you with some facts. First of all, as we have noted, the only long-term solution to the problem of Idlib, and to be frank, of Syria as a whole, is a final and irreversible expulsion from the country of all terrorists. And please don't tell us that we're exaggerating the problem or try to rehabilitate the reputation of Tahir al-Sham. The report of the Secretary General, number 141, has clearly explained described the people with whom some members of the Council are trying to work with, and I quote: killings, abductions, detainments, public executions of journalists, public officials, medical workers, ban on public assemblies, and other acts. And this is all in paragraph 15 that I just quoted. As for the issue of the ratio of peaceful citizens to fighters, well, even if there aren't very many fighters, they're still capable of carrying out their atrocities across the entire province. So their number doesn't really matter. This is an irrelevant argument. Secondly, at every meeting we're told that Damascus does not cooperate. The goal is clear: to create an illusion that there's no progress with humanitarian access, and thus to make the well-worn conclusion that the government it's not possible to reach an agreement with the government. Even today we've heard similar statements. In the meantime, The Syrian government has increased the number of approvals for humanitarian operations to 600 a month. In the country, all UN agencies and 28 international NGOs are registered and working. This is in paragraph 38 of the report. Furthermore, the lion's share of the above-mentioned approvals, 95% to be precise, are so-called blanket approvals, giving humanitarian agencies flexibility compared to other forms of approvals. So in principle, they don't restrict the number of humanitarian missions in the approved regions, which is why they are particularly valued by the humanitarian community. And these kinds of approvals, I will repeat, over the past 2 months, the Syrian side has issued 1,193 such blanket approvals in paragraph 32 of the report. The number of people covered by such assistance is 4.4 million people just over the past 2 months. I will remind you that according to paragraph 31 of the report, there is 1,700 UN staff members in the country, and that is only staff members of the UN, not mentioning local humanitarian personnel and partners. And they were given visas, all of them. Today was always ignored. We get the impression that some of our colleagues simply don't read the reports of the Secretary General. We're not trying to say that there are no problems. There are problems, and the report does mention them. We simply ask you not to paint everything in black and white, and not to remain silent about the reverse side of the coin, and not to rush with conclusions. Sorry, not to rush to bury the Astana format. As in many other countries, we're working with the Syrian side to resolve existing difficulties. However, the country is fighting terrorists. They don't have access to natural resources. Manufacturing cycles have been interrupted, and unilateral sanctions are aimed at undermining the effectiveness of state government. Active terrorist cells are operating in the country, which have no qualms to use the humanitarian factor in their dirty information and military struggle. And this applies to reports about the bombing of schools and hospitals. There's no UN presence in Idlib, and to confirm such a bombing, it's enough to basically make 2 phone calls. We have often identified such fakes based on this kind of supposed reliable information. Today, our American colleagues spoke of bombings against IDP camps. As is stated in the report of Madame Mueller, over this time, there is only one example of shelling of a camp of IDPs, the Dana camp, and in fact, it wasn't an airstrike; it was artillery shelling. Could you please speak clear when you speak about this? Thirdly, as soon as the report of the Secretary General about the alternative modalities to Eurubia published, since it has been issued, let us also introduce some clarity and give an alternate point of view with referring to the text of the report itself. I would just recall the whole information campaign defending this border point pursued one goal: not to allow any changes in the cross-border mechanism. Since this was always presented as a legal precedent in the context of international law, colleagues every year has defended its not being changed in any way, and we understood these arguments. However, we did not share them. The specific argument on Eurubia, I'll just recall, was based on 2 points. First of all, there are no alternatives to Eurubia, and it was possible only to reach people in the northeast of Syria from Damascus through Iraq. All other options were considered as nonsense, including Russian and Syrian proposals. Let's once again now look at another report, now Report 139. The first fact, other than some medical objects, I will say all cargoes, all deliveries, including food, equipment and hygiene equipment, were delivered from the Euphrates area, from within Syria, and not from Iraq. These are paragraphs 12 and 13 of and 41 of the report. And they continue to be delivered on the 18th of February from Damascus to Kamishla, a UNFPA convoy. This is in paragraph 40. Earlier, WFP covered the same route. Now, as far as the fact that there are no alternatives to Yerubia, the whole final part of the report specifically outlines these alternatives, and the most feasible one is to receive approval from Damascus for the only type of humanitarian cargo that is not covered by regular deliveries through Syria, and that is medical supplies. At the past meeting, I demonstrated the Syrian note to the resident coordinator of the UN with an approval to deliver a cargo that has been delayed in Iraq. Damascus issued that approval in one day. It was not possible to actually carry it out due to security reasons, and we understand that. Yesterday, the government gave approval for delivery of medical supplies from warehouses in Damascus to the northeast of the country. The February convoy of UNFPA, which I already mentioned, covered that route in 4.5 days. So from the point of view of security, it is acceptable since the UNDSS agreed to it. So the Syrian troops have cleared the key route, Damascus-Aleppo, and I imagine that if my colleagues allowed Syrian permanent representative Bashar Jafari, without limiting his speaking time, or ignoring his words, he would demonstrate in detail the kind of efforts undertaken by the Syrian government in the humanitarian sphere in conditions when the Western community are basically choking his country with sanctions. Now, the report also refutes the wailing of some colleagues, some members of the Security Council, about the acute lack of medical supplies in the northeastern provinces of Syria. Paragraph 5 of the report speaks about the opposite, the fact that hospitals have supplies that will last until May. The only thing of which a lack might occur is reproductive health. There'll be shortages there, but even there we still have a month, and this is mentioned in the report. Let me just recall that the Syrian side has already agreed to air delivery of supplies from Erbil, from Iraqi Erbil. And that approval is in the same note. So no matter how 7 members of the Security Council have tried to dramatize the situation, Secretary General has acknowledged that there is progress. He also called on the sides to provide support until all the medical supplies have been successfully delivered to the hospitals. And we are ready to continue assisting this process and call on everyone else to do that. We once again would like to recall the calmer we do this, the more professionally we approach this issue, the better the chances of a successful resolution. Thank you very much for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation and